Hey history fans, and welcome back. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the past. We're not looking at shiny knights or fancy kings, though they get plenty of screen time, don't they? Instead, we're going to talk about some of the toughest, most forgotten heroes of the medieval world. Mothers. These were the women who, quite literally, kept humanity going, often with about as much recognition as the mud on a peasant's boots. Now, when you think of a medieval mom, you might picture someone from a fairy tale, maybe a calm lady in a pretty headscarf, rocking a baby in a sunny cottage. Perhaps a bluebird lands on her finger. Or maybe a queen looking after her royal kids, all of them suspiciously well-behaved and clean. Sounds nice, right? Well, tonight, we're going to gently take that sweet storybook idea and toss it right out the nearest, probably very drafty, window. Because for most medieval moms, life wasn't just hard, it was brutal. We're talking a level of difficulty that makes being a parent today, even on those days when the kids have drawn on the dog with permanent marker and the Wi-Fi is down, look like a luxury spa vacation with endless free snacks and a guarantee of 8 hours of sleep. So before you fall asleep dreaming of knights and honey wine, that's mead, by the way, and it probably tasted a bit like feet. Do me a favor, hit that like button. If you like these history stories, subscribe if you're new. Join the team. We have metaphorical jackets. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always cool to see our history group from all over the world, from chilly mornings in Alaska to warm evenings in Australia. All right, get comfy, maybe turn down the lights a little more, and let's go back to a time when being a mom meant dealing with death, sickness, and dirt every single day. And you were probably pregnant with your 7th kid by age 25, wondering if this one would make it past Tuesday. This is why life was brutal for medieval mothers. Forget your 5 a.m. alarm, your fancy coffee machine, or that gentle yoga routine you try to squeeze in. As a medieval mother, your day started when the rooster had its first full-blown existential crisis, usually way before the sun even considered dragging itself over the horizon. There was no snooze button for you, unless you count the family pig. Let's call him Hubert, nudging your feet with his snout, reminding you that his breakfast was also overdue, and he wasn't about to write a polite letter to complain. Picture this. You're Agnes, a regular peasant woman in, let's say, 13th century England, or maybe France. It doesn't really matter. The level of discomfort was pretty universal. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of straw on a cold, wet dirt floor. And this straw, let me tell you, has probably seen more action than a knight's sword. And not in a good way. It's lumpy, it's scratchy, and it's definitely home to a thriving community of fleas, lice, and other tiny, uninvited guests who consider your body their personal buffet. If you're lucky, you share this luxurious sleeping arrangement with your husband and a couple of your youngest kids, all huddled together for warmth. This was like a human-powered, eco-friendly heater that also happened to be a highly efficient germ-sharing system. Personal space? That was a concept about as common as a dragon sighting. It was a luxury yet to be invented, much like effective medicine, reliable plumbing, or the idea of a weekend. The closest thing to me time for you was probably when everyone else was asleep and you were just too tired to move, staring at a cobweb. First thing in the morning wasn't checking your phone for updates. It was a frantic scramble for basic survival. Getting water was a big, immediate job. No taps, obviously. No convenient kitchen sink. This meant a trek, often a long one, for you to the closest well or stream. This journey was usually undertaken in the freezing pre-dawn dark, carrying heavy wooden buckets that probably leaked. Your shoulders would be aching before the day had even properly begun. And that water? Not exactly filtered, bottled spring water with a hint of cucumber. It was probably shared with the village livestock, cows, sheep, Hubert the pig, and served as the dumping ground for anything else the village decided it didn't want anymore. Think of it as a community soup, but one you really didn't want to drink. Getting sick from bad water, with things like dysentery or cholera, wasn't a rare occurrence. It was practically a seasonal event, like a really unwelcome festival. Then, the fire. The heart of your home, but also a massive pain to manage. If it had gone out during the night, which it often did, because firewood was precious and not to be wasted, getting it started again with bits of flint, steel, and some hopefully dry tinder, like dried grass or moss, was a super important and often incredibly frustrating job for you. Your fingers would be numb with cold, you'd be squinting in the dim light, and if you didn't get it going, there was no cooked food, no warmth against the damp chill, and a much, much crankier family. And let's be real, a medieval family, living in close quarters with constant hardship, was usually operating at a baseline level of grumpiness that could curdle milk from 10 paces. A cold hearth just made everything worse. Breakfast, if you can even call it that without insulting actual food, was usually pretty sad and repetitive. Pottage was the star of the show, every day. Think of it as a medieval whatever's in the pot soup, or maybe perpetual stew. It was a thick, gooey concoction of grains like oats, barley, or rye. Wheat was for the fancy folks. Into this went any vegetables you had. Onions, leeks, turnips were common, maybe some cabbage, peas, or beans if you were lucky. And maybe, if the gods were feeling particularly generous, or a rat had fallen in, a tiny piece of bacon fat, or a bone for taste. This stuff often simmered on the fire for days, with new bits and bobs thrown in whenever you found something edible. It was less a carefully planned meal and more an ongoing science experiment in basic sustenance. You'd have it with a chunk of dark, heavy bread, so hard you could probably use it as a weapon in a pinch, or maybe to sharpen a knife. If you had owned a medieval Fitbit, it would have just displayed a little skull emoji by 7 a.m. and then promptly given up, knowing the day was only going to get worse for your step count. If you were a peasant mom, which most medieval moms were, your day was then filled with incredibly hard physical work in the fields alongside your husband. Plowing, often with a heavy, awkward wooden plow that you might even have to help pull if you didn't have an ox, or if the ox was also having an existential crisis. Then came planting seeds by hand, bending over for hours, pulling weeds, and then harvesting the crops with a simple sickle, all done by hand or with very basic, often homemade, tools. There was no such thing as maternity leave for you. Being pregnant, even heavily pregnant, didn't mean you got out of helping the family survive. You worked until you physically just couldn't anymore, and sometimes even after that, because if the crops didn't come in, nobody ate. But the farm work, as exhausting as it was just one of your many, many jobs. Back in your one-room, smoke-filled, dimly lit hut, windows were often just small holes in the wall, maybe covered with wooden shutters or a piece of greasy, stretched animal skin to keep out the worst of the wind and rain, but not much else. A whole new shift of chores started for you. You had to grind grain into flour using a heavy, hand-operated quernstone. That was a workout that would make a modern gym expert cry and demand a protein shake. You'd be spinning wool from your sheep or flax, a plant fiber, into thread, a never-ending task, and then weaving that thread into rough, scratchy cloth to make or fix the family's few precious clothes. Making candles from animal fat, known as tallow candles, which smelled awful and smoked a lot. Making soap, a rare and even smellier affair, often using animal fat and wood ash. Taking care of the small vegetable garden near your hut, the kitchen garden that provided many of those pottage ingredients. And saving any extra food for the long, lean winter months by drying, salting, or pickling. These were all your jobs, squeezed in around everything else. And the kids. We'll get to the truly awful details of childbirth and how many babies and young children died later on. But assuming some of your kids had survived those early years, taking care of them was a constant, demanding job woven into every other chore. Little toddlers running around underfoot in a hut filled with open fires, sharp tools, and not much in the way of safety features. Older children needing to be taught their own chores and kept out of serious trouble. And babies needing to be fed, usually breastfed, which was another demand on your body, cleaned as much as possible, and somehow kept alive, which, given the conditions, was a daily miracle. There were no washing machines, no dishwashers, no vacuum cleaners, no disposable diapers. Cleaning for you meant sweeping the dirt floor with a broom made of twigs, which mostly just moved the dirt around a bit. Laundry was a monumental, all-day effort that meant hauling all that heavy water again, heating some of it over the precious fire, scrubbing clothes with harsh lye soap, if you even had soap, in a wooden tub or down at the cold, rocky stream, beating the clothes against stones, and then hoping they'd dry before they got moldy, or, in winter, froze solid into stiff, unwearable shapes. It's genuinely hard for us, with all our modern conveniences, to imagine how incredibly tired you would have been, all the time. Every single day was like running a marathon, from before sunrise until long after sunset, often working by the dim light of a single candle or the flickering hearth. The only breaks were when your body, your kids, or the never-ending cycle of survival demanded something different from you. There were no sick days. If you were ill, the work still had to be done somehow. There were no breaks for your mind, no me time to recharge. Your entire life was all about serving others, working incredibly hard, and just getting by with almost nothing. And through all of this, remember, you were probably pregnant again, or breastfeeding a baby, or still recovering from having just had a baby a few months earlier. You weren't just multitasking, you were multi-surviving, on a level that boggles the mind. Your reward for all this relentless effort? The slim, precious chance that your family would live to see another day, that there would be food in their bellies, and that they might make it through another harsh winter. It's a tough, bleak picture, and believe it or not, this is just the start of understanding how truly brutal your life was. If daily life for you as a medieval mother was a relentless grind, then getting pregnant and carrying a baby for 9 months was like being forced to play a dangerous game, where you didn't know the rules, the dice were loaded against you, and the penalty for losing was often your own life or your baby's. There was no such thing as the prenatal care we know today. No regular doctor's visits, no ultrasounds to get a sneak peek at the baby, no blood tests to check for problems, no obstetricians offering gentle advice and handing out pamphlets on healthy eating. When you were pregnant in medieval times, you were largely on your own, armed with a potent cocktail of old wives' tales passed down from your mother and grandmother, deeply held religious hope, and a kind of stoic, brave acceptance that things could go very, very wrong at any moment. When you first realized you were pregnant, a diagnosis usually confirmed by the obvious signs like missed periods and the delightful onset of morning sickness, which, by the way, you probably just had to endure while still doing all your chores. You wouldn't be rushing to a clinic to get a confirmation and a due date. Instead, you might quietly consult the local wise woman or an experienced older woman in the village, perhaps the midwife. This woman would offer advice and remedies based on a mixture of practical experience with herbs, long-held traditions, and a healthy dose of superstition. Some of this advice might have been vaguely sensible, like suggesting you eat certain nourishing foods if they were available, or get as much rest as you could. Of course, getting rest was a laughable idea for most peasant women like you. Other advice, however, would be, well, less than scientific. Maybe you'd be told to wear a specific amulet, like a piece of coral or a special stone, to ward off evil spirits or the evil eye that might be intent on harming you or your unborn baby. You might be warned to avoid looking at certain animals like hares or weasels, lest your child be born with a hair lip or some other deformity. Or perhaps you'd be told to avoid stepping over graves or walking under ladders. Science was not exactly leading the charge in medieval prenatal guidance. It was more like a game of, don't upset the universe, just in case. What you ate as a pregnant peasant woman probably didn't change much from your usual, small and often unsatisfying meals. There were no special prenatal vitamins, no public health campaigns lecturing you on the importance of folic acid or iron. You ate what the family ate, the endless pottage, the coarse, dark bread, and whatever vegetables or occasional tiny bits of meat were available. If the harvest was poor that year, or if famine struck the region, which happened with depressing regularity, you, like everyone else in your family and village, simply starved or came very close to it. Chronic malnutrition was rampant, and this had serious consequences. It led to babies being born with low birth weights, making them much more vulnerable to disease and death. It increased the risk of complications during your pregnancy itself, and it made you weaker and less able to cope with the rigors of childbirth and the demands of breastfeeding. For noble women, the diet might have been more plentiful, with more meat, fish, and wine, but it wasn't necessarily healthier by modern standards. It was often heavy and rich, and fresh vegetables and fruits were sometimes viewed with suspicion or considered peasant food, ironically meaning they might also miss out on vital nutrients. One of the most brutal aspects of medieval pregnancy, especially if you were a peasant, was that life and work didn't stop or even slow down much. You would continue your back-breaking labor in the fields or at home for as long as you were physically able, often right up until the first pains of labor began. Hauling those heavy buckets of water, grinding grain with the heavy quernstone, bending over for hours to weed crops or harvest vegetables. These activities didn't cease just because you were carrying a child. Imagine being 8 months pregnant, your body already tired and strained, and still having to manually till a field or carry a heavy load of firewood. It's a recipe for utter exhaustion, accidents, and serious complications like premature labor. If you were a noble woman, of course, you had it much easier in terms of physical labor. You weren't out in the fields, but you faced your own intense pressures. The immense dynastic importance of producing a healthy heir, preferably a male one, to carry on the family name and inherit the lands and titles. Your pregnancies were very public events, scrutinized by the entire court for any sign of weakness, illness, or, heaven forbid, failure to produce the desired outcome. Any hint of a problem could become fodder for gossip and political maneuvering. Losing a baby before it was born, a miscarriage, or having a baby born dead, a stillbirth, were tragically common events for you and women like you. With no real understanding of genetics, the causes of infections, or many underlying health conditions that can affect pregnancy, these losses were often attributed to supernatural causes. It was a punishment for your sin or your family's, the result of witchcraft or a curse from an enemy, or simply the inexplicable will or displeasure of God. The emotional toll on you, if you experienced these losses, must have been immense. A deep and private sorrow. Yet, in a society where such events were frequent, there was often little space or time for public displays of grief or prolonged mourning. Life, and the relentless pressure to try again and produce more children, had to go on. This didn't mean the pain wasn't there. It was just often buried under layers of duty and resignation. The fear of death during pregnancy or childbirth was your constant, chilling companion. You knew someone, a sister, a mother, an aunt, a cousin, a neighbor, who had died in childbed. It wasn't a remote, abstract possibility. It was an ever-present, tangible threat that loomed over every pregnancy you had. This fear was woven into your daily prayers, into your quiet anxieties, and into the very fabric of your female existence. You prayed to specific saints, like Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, for a safe delivery and a healthy child, hoping for some divine intervention in a process that felt largely out of your control. And let's not forget the immense societal pressure on you. Your worth, in the eyes of your family and the wider community, was often directly and cruelly tied to your fertility. Your ability to produce children, especially healthy sons who could inherit land and titles if you were noble, or provide essential labor for the family farm if you were a peasant, was paramount. If you were barren, meaning unable to conceive, or if you only produced daughters, you could face shame, ostracization, and even the possibility of your husband seeking to set you aside for a more fertile partner. Though divorce or annulment was complex, expensive, and rare, it was still a threat, particularly for the powerful. Each pregnancy you undertook was therefore a gamble, not just for your physical health and survival, but for your social standing, your security within your marriage, and your very identity as a woman in medieval society. The only gender reveal party you had was the anxious, breathless wait after the baby was finally born, to see if it survived its first few critical hours and days. And then, particularly if you were noble, but also for many peasant families who needed sons to work the land, there was the further anxiety of whether it was the desired boy. There were no sonograms to offer you a sneak peek and allow for planning or dashed hopes beforehand. There was only the long wait, filled with hope, superstition, and perhaps some very specific prayers to saints, who were thought to have a special influence on producing male offspring. So, for 9 long, uncertain months, you, the medieval mother, navigated a perilous and often lonely journey. You carried not just a child within you, but also the heavy weight of societal expectation, the constant, gnawing shadow of death, and the unceasing burden of your daily work. And you did it all without the medical knowledge, the nutritional understanding, or the supportive healthcare systems that we so often take for granted today. It wasn't a glowing, serene, Instagram-worthy experience. It was a profound testament to human endurance, courage, and the powerful will to bring new life into a very unwelcoming world. If being pregnant in medieval times was like playing a high-stakes game of chance for you, then the actual act of childbirth was like being thrown into the arena with a hungry lion, armed only with a prayer and maybe a damp cloth. This was, quite simply, one of the most dangerous and terrifying events in your life, and it was a leading cause of death for women of childbearing age across all social classes. Forget those serene images of calm water births with soothing playlists and aromatherapy. For you, medieval childbirth was a raw, visceral, often incredibly painful and profoundly risky ordeal, more akin to a battle for survival than a celebrated medical event. When labor began for you, you wouldn't be whisked off to a sterile, well-equipped hospital maternity ward. You'd most likely give birth at home, in the same smoky, drafty, and probably not very clean hut where you lived, ate, and slept every day. Your birthing environment was whatever patch of earth floor or straw-filled bed could be hastily cleared. If you were lucky, some fresh straw might be laid down, or perhaps some old linens, but cleanliness, as we understand it, was an alien concept. If you were a noblewoman, you might have had more comfortable chambers, perhaps a dedicated birthing room, but even your surroundings were far from the hygienic standards we expect today. Germs were having a field day, and nobody knew it. The primary attendant at your birth was usually a midwife. These were local women, often older and respected in the community, who had gained their experience through years of apprenticeship and by observing countless births. They possessed a wealth of practical, hands-on knowledge about the normal process of childbirth. They knew how to assist you with a straightforward delivery. They had techniques for trying to turn a breech baby, that's a baby coming out feeder bottom first, which was a highly risky and often fatal situation for both you and your baby. And they had a collection of herbal remedies that were believed to ease your pain, hasten your labor, or stop your bleeding. However, their understanding was based on tradition, observation, and a fair bit of superstition, not on scientific medical training. When serious complications arose, and they frequently did, the midwife's options were severely limited and often tragically ineffective. They were doing their best in a world that offered few good answers for you. Pain relief during your labor? That was largely a myth, a cruel joke. While some herbal concoctions, perhaps involving poppy or henbane, might have had mild sedative or pain-dulling effects for you, there was absolutely nothing remotely comparable to an epidural or even strong, reliable painkillers like morphine. You endured the agony of labor, which could last for days, with a combination of stoicism, fervent prayer, and perhaps the physical and emotional support of female relatives and the midwife holding your hands or wiping your brow. Screaming, crying, moaning, and praying aloud to God or various saints were all accepted and expected parts of your process. The idea of a silent birth or a pain-free delivery would have been utterly alien and probably viewed with suspicion. Sometimes, ale or wine might be offered to you, but this was likely more for a fleeting moment of courage or distraction than for any actual pain relief. It might have just made you a tired, drunk person in terrible pain. The risks you faced were astronomical, and death was a constant, hovering presence. Postpartum hemorrhage? That's excessive. Uncontrolled bleeding after your baby was born was a major killer. With no understanding of how to effectively manage blood loss, no blood transfusions available, and no reliable drugs to help your uterus contract properly, you could bleed to death in a matter of hours, leaving behind a newborn and a grieving family. It was a swift and terrifying end. Infection, often called childbed fever or puerperal fever, was another rampant and indiscriminate murderer for women like you. In an era with absolutely no understanding of germ theory, the idea that tiny, invisible organisms could cause disease, basic hygiene, was an afterthought. Unwashed hands of attendants, contaminated birthing environments, remember, often the same room where animals might also live or where daily life produced plenty of dirt, and frequent internal examinations, often with those same unwashed hands, could introduce deadly bacteria directly into your body. If a fever, chills, and abdominal pain set in for you a few days after birth, it was often a death sentence. The infection would spread rapidly, and without antibiotics, there was little anyone could do but watch you and pray. Obstructed labor, where your baby simply couldn't pass through the birth canal due to its size, position, or your small pelvis, was a catastrophic and agonizing scenario. Without the option of a safe cesarean section, which, if attempted at all in the medieval period, was almost always fatal to the mother and was usually only performed as a last resort to try and save the baby for baptism if the mother was already dying or dead. Both you and your baby were likely to perish after days of excruciating, fruitless labor. Midwives might try various desperate maneuvers to extract the baby from you, some of them incredibly brutal and invasive, but these often caused severe internal injuries to you, leading to fistulas, abnormal connections between organs, chronic pain, or death from infection, even if the baby was eventually delivered. Even if you miraculously survived the birth itself, the postpartum period, the weeks following delivery, was still fraught with danger for you. A retained placenta, where parts of the placenta didn't come out after your birth, could lead to life-threatening bleeding or infection. Uterine prolapse, where your womb sags or falls out of place due to the strain of childbirth, could cause you chronic pain and disability. And ongoing infections, even from minor tears, could fester and claim your life weeks or even months later. All this while you were expected to recover quickly, begin the demanding task of breastfeeding around the clock, and somehow resume your endless household chores and agricultural labor. There was no concept of a 6-week postpartum checkup with a doctor for you, no mandated rest period, no support services for new mothers. You had a baby, you got on with it, or you died. The spiritual dimension of your childbirth was also incredibly intense. Birth was seen as a moment, literally hovering between life and death, a sacred and perilous passage. Prayers were constant throughout your labor. The midwife might use religious charms, sprinkle holy water, or recite specific incantations believed to protect you and your child. If your labor was particularly difficult or prolonged, a priest might be called to your bedside to pray over you, to hear your confession, or even to perform an emergency baptism for the baby if it seemed unlikely to survive. The church taught that women suffered so intensely in childbirth as a direct consequence of Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden. Frankly, that probably wasn't the most comforting or empowering thought for you when you were in the throes of agonizing contractions. It added a layer of spiritual burden to the physical torment. If you were a noblewoman, the stakes of childbirth were arguably even higher, though the physical dangers were similar. The birth of an heir, especially a male heir, was a major political event, crucial for the continuation of the dynasty and the stability of the estate or even the kingdom. More attendants might be present at your birth, perhaps even a university-trained male physician. Though they rarely got involved in the actual hands-on delivery unless things were dire, and their interventions, often based on abstract theories rather than practical experience, were frequently more harmful than helpful. But even with more resources, more attendants, and a more comfortable setting, the fundamental dangers of hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor remain the same for you. Queens, duchesses, and countesses died in childbed, just as peasant women did, their deaths sometimes plunging entire regions into succession crises or political turmoil. Surviving childbirth was a profound relief for you, a moment of triumph against terrifying odds. But it was often just a prelude to the next great and daunting challenge, keeping your newborn alive in a world filled with threats. And for you yourself, if you had made it through this gauntlet, it was often just a brief respite before the relentless cycle of pregnancy and birth would likely begin anew, continuing until your childbearing years were over, or until childbirth finally claimed you. Each birth was a fresh roll of the dice, a stark and brutal testament to the sheer, terrifying vulnerability of your motherhood in the medieval world. So you've somehow, against all odds, made it through the perilous ordeal of childbirth. You're utterly exhausted, probably still bleeding, and in considerable pain, definitely sore in places you didn't know could be sore, but you're holding a newborn baby in your arms. A moment of pure, unadulterated joy, perhaps, for a fleeting second. But that joy was almost certainly heavily laced with a deep, gnawing fear. Because keeping that tiny, incredibly fragile new life going was your next monumental and often heartbreaking battle. The number of babies and young children who died in the medieval period was, to put it as mildly as possible, horrific. We're talking about rates of infant and child mortality that would cause a global public health emergency and widespread panic today. Historians and demographers who study these grim statistics estimate that anywhere from a shocking 25%, that's 1 in every 4 babies you might have, to a staggering 50%, or 1 in every 2, of all children born died before they reached their first birthday. Let that sink in. Half. And if a child managed to survive that first incredibly perilous year, another significant percentage wouldn't live to see their 5th birthday or even their 10th. Imagine having multiple children, as you most likely would, knowing that, statistically, there was a very good chance that half of them, or even more, might not survive to adulthood. This was your grim, everyday reality as a medieval mother, a constant backdrop of loss and anxiety to your already difficult life. Why were the rates so devastatingly high for your children? Well, let's count the ways. Because there were many, many dangers lurking around every corner for a medieval infant. First and foremost were the immediate dangers surrounding the birth process itself. We've already talked about how dangerous childbirth was for you, but it was equally, if not more so, for your baby. Prematurity was a common problem, often linked to your own poor health or malnutrition. Babies born too early, or with a very low birth weight, were incredibly vulnerable, their tiny bodies often too weak to cope with the challenges of life outside the womb. Birth injuries sustained during a long or difficult labor, or from the sometimes rough interventions of a midwife trying to deliver a stuck baby, could also mean your infant was too damaged to survive its first few days or weeks. Then came the relentless onslaught of diseases. With no vaccines to prevent common childhood illnesses, no antibiotics to treat infections, and a very limited, often incorrect understanding of hygiene and how diseases spread, illnesses that are now easily preventable or treatable were virtual death sentences for your children. Measles, smallpox, diphtheria, whooping cough, pertussis, scarlet fever. These highly contagious diseases swept through communities in regular epidemics, taking a terrible toll on the youngest and most vulnerable members of the population. Their little immune systems simply couldn't fight them off. Dysentery and other severe diarrheal diseases, often caused by drinking contaminated water or eating spoiled food, were rampant and particularly lethal for infants and young children. They would lead to rapid, severe dehydration, and without access to things like intravenous fluids or even basic oral rehydration solutions, death often followed quickly. A simple case of the runs could kill your baby in a day or two. Malnutrition was a constant, insidious shadow hanging over your children's early lives. If you were malnourished during your pregnancy, your baby was born already at a significant disadvantage, often underweight and with a weaker constitution. Breastfeeding was absolutely crucial for infant survival, providing not only vital nutrients, but also some passive immunity from you against common infections. You would breastfeed for as long as you possibly could, often for 2 years or even longer, if you didn't become pregnant again too quickly. However, if you yourself were sick, starving, or severely overworked, your milk supply could fail, or its quality could be poor. If you were wealthy, hiring a wet nurse, another woman, often from a poorer background who was also lactating, was an option, but this came with its own set of risks. The wet nurse might be unhealthy herself, passing on diseases to your infant, or her own child might suffer from neglect or insufficient milk if she was primarily feeding your baby. Once your child was weaned from the breast, they were introduced to the same monotonous, often nutritionally poor and unbalanced diet as the rest of the family, mainly pottage and coarse bread. Vitamin deficiencies were extremely common, leading to debilitating conditions like rickets, caused by lack of vitamin D, resulting in soft, deformed bones, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, and general failure to thrive. Accidents were another major and tragic cause of death for your young children. Medieval homes and villages were not child-proofed in any way, shape, or form. Open hearth fires burned constantly in the center of most homes, a source of warmth and cooking, but also a deadly hazard for curious toddlers. Sharp tools used for farming or crafts were often left lying around. Dangerous animals, both domestic, like aggressive dogs or easily spooked livestock, and wild, if your village was near a forest, posed threats. Open wells, ponds, and rivers were constant drowning risks for unsupervised children. Toddlers could easily wander into trouble. And with you overwhelmed with an endless list of chores and often caring for multiple children of different ages, constant vigilant supervision was simply impossible. Burns from falling into the fire or upsetting hot cooking pots, drownings, injuries from falls from rickety ladders, uneven floors, or just general clumsiness, or being kicked or trampled by animals, were tragically frequent occurrences in your world, the emotional toll of such frequent child loss on you is hard for us to truly fathom. To invest so much love, care, physical effort, and hope into a child, only to watch them fade away from a fever, a hacking cough, an unstoppable diarrhea, or a sudden accident, must have been devastating beyond words. And for many medieval mothers like you, this wasn't a one-time tragedy. It was a repeated, soul-crushing experience throughout your childbearing years. Some historians have suggested that parents in the medieval period might have developed a degree of emotional distance or detachment from their very young children, perhaps as a psychological coping mechanism against the high likelihood of loss. The idea being, don't get too attached, because they probably won't make it. Others argue, more convincingly I think, that the grief was just as profound and agonizing as it is for parents today, but perhaps it was expressed differently, or more privately, within a society where death, especially the death of children, was a much more visible, frequent, and accepted, though never easy, part of everyday life. There was a certain fatalism, a sense that this was just the way of the world. Baptism, the Christian sacrament of initiation, was an incredibly urgent and important ritual for your children. Given the appallingly high infant mortality rate, you and your husband were extremely anxious to have your newborns baptized as quickly as possible, often within days or even hours of birth if the baby seemed weak. This was to ensure that if the child died, its soul would be cleansed of original sin and would be able to enter heaven. A child dying unbaptized was a source of immense spiritual distress and anxiety for you, as you feared for the fate of your child's immortal soul. This urgency added another layer of stress to the already fraught period immediately following birth. The sheer number of tiny graves that archaeologists find in medieval cemeteries tells a heartbreaking and silent story. For you, as a medieval mother, any joy you felt at a new birth was always tempered by the chilling, inescapable knowledge that this precious new life was incredibly fragile and could be snatched away at any moment. Every cough from the cradle, every feverish brow, every unusual cry was a potential sign of impending loss. It was a heavy, constant burden of grief, anxiety, and helplessness that you carried with you every single day of your mothering life. If your child managed to navigate the treacherous waters of infancy and survive those perilous first few years, they didn't exactly transition into a carefree world of playdates, educational toys, and helicopter parenting. The very concept of childhood, as we understand it today, a distinct, protected phase of life, filled with innocence, learning primarily through play, and shielded from the harsh realities of adult life, was largely absent in the medieval period, especially if you were a peasant. For you, as a medieval mother, raising children wasn't about nurturing their delicate sensibilities. It was about preparing them, as quickly and efficiently as possible, for a harsh, demanding, and often dangerous reality. And that preparation started very, very young. Your children in medieval society were, for all intents and purposes, seen as miniature adults, or at least adults in training. As soon as they were physically capable, which was often around the tender age of 5 or 6, sometimes even younger, they were expected to contribute meaningfully to the family's economy and daily workload. There were no child labor laws, no debates about appropriate working hours for youngsters. Little hands were put to work performing a variety of tasks, scaring birds away from newly sown crops in the fields, gathering firewood from the woods, a task that could be dangerous if they wandered too far or encountered unfriendly animals or people, fetching water from the well or stream, those heavy buckets again, tending to younger siblings while you were otherwise occupied, feeding the chickens or pigs, or helping with simple household chores like sweeping the floor, or trying to, and stirring the... For your peasant children, this meant long hours of physical labor, often in the same harsh weather conditions and with the same rudimentary tools as you and your husband. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity for the family's survival. A boy would typically learn to help his father in the fields, with animal husbandry, or perhaps with a craft like carpentry or blacksmithing, if the family had such a skill. A girl, meanwhile, would be apprenticed to you from a very early age, learning the endless and complex tasks of running a household, preparing food, spinning thread, weaving cloth, gardening, and caring for the sick. Formal education, in the sense of learning to read, write, and do arithmetic, was an extreme rarity, a privilege reserved almost exclusively for the sons of the nobility, who needed to learn to manage estates and perhaps engage in diplomacy or warfare, or for those boys who were destined for a life in the church as monks or priests. Most of your peasant children, and virtually all peasant girls, received no schooling whatsoever. Their education was entirely practical, focused on acquiring the skills they would need for survival and for their future roles as peasant farmers, laborers, wives, and mothers. You would be the primary educator for your daughters, teaching them everything from how to spin wool without breaking the thread, to how to weave basic cloth, how to cook the family meals over an open fire, how to manage a small vegetable garden, how to preserve food for winter, how to care for livestock, and how to look after babies and young children. You would teach your sons, alongside their father, about the rhythms of farming, the care of animals, or a trade if the family specialized in one. Literacy rates were incredibly low, probably less than 10% for the general population, and even lower for women and peasants. The world was understood primarily through oral tradition. Stories, songs, proverbs you told them, through direct observation of the natural world and adult activities, and through the pervasive religious teachings of the church, which were usually delivered orally by the local priest. Discipline in your child rearing was often harsh and swift by our standards. The idea of gentle parenting, positive reinforcement, or lengthy discussions about feelings would have been met with blank stares from you, or more likely, a quick whack with a wooden spoon or a switch. Physical punishment was common, widely accepted, and considered absolutely necessary to instill obedience, respect for elders, and a proper fear of God in your children. The biblical adage, "Spare the rod and spoil the child," was a guiding principle for many parents like you. This wasn't necessarily born out of innate cruelty, but rather from a deeply ingrained belief that children needed to learn the rules of a dangerous and unforgiving world quickly and thoroughly. Disobedience, carelessness, or laziness could have serious, even fatal, consequences in a society where survival depended on everyone doing their part. Your sternness, and even your willingness to use physical discipline, could therefore be seen as a form of tough love, a way of protecting your children by teaching them the harsh lessons they needed to survive. Play, of course, still happened for your children. Kids are inherently resilient and creative, and they will always find ways to amuse themselves, even in the direst of circumstances. They might play with very simple, often homemade toys. Perhaps dolls you fashioned from rags or scraps of wood, roughly carved animals, balls made of stitched leather or inflated pig bladders, which were surprisingly popular. Games were often rough and tumble, frequently mimicking adult activities like farming, fighting, or hunting. They might play tag, have wrestling matches, or engage in imaginative play based on the stories and legends you or other elders told them. But playtime was something that was squeezed in between chores and responsibilities, not a primary focus of their day. There wasn't the luxury of dedicated leisure time or organized recreational activities for most medieval children. Their playground was the village green, the fields, or the woods, all places that also held potential dangers. One of your most crucial and constant roles as a mother was protecting your children from the myriad dangers that lurked everywhere in the medieval world. We've already talked about the high risks from disease and accidents within the home, but there were other threats too. Malicious or hungry animals. Wolves were still a real threat in many parts of Europe. Contaminated food or water, which was a constant concern, and even the risk of violence from other humans. This could come from bandits on the road, from feuding neighbors, or especially during times of unrest, war, or invasion, when soldiers might pass through the countryside. You had to be constantly vigilant, teaching your children to be wary, to be observant, and to be resourceful. You were their first and often only line of defense in a world that offered very few safety nets or protections for the young and vulnerable. You taught them which berries were safe to eat and which were poisonous, where it was safe to play and where danger lurked, how to behave around strangers, and the importance of sticking together. The bond between you and your children, despite the harshness of the era and the often stern discipline, was undoubtedly strong and deeply significant. You were their primary source of nourishment, especially in infancy, through breastfeeding. You were their main source of comfort, however limited by your own exhaustion and the lack of material comforts. And you were their most important teacher for the skills of daily life. You passed on not just practical skills, but also the family stories, the local songs and dances, and the cultural and religious values of their community. The lullabies you sang to a fretful baby might have been about saints, local heroes, or magical creatures, but they were sung with a mother's love and a desire to soothe. The lessons you taught, though often delivered with a firm hand and a no-nonsense attitude, were ultimately intended to equip your children for survival in a very challenging world. If you were a noble mother, your experience of raising children, as with everything else, could be quite different, though not without its own set of challenges. While you also faced the anxieties of high child mortality and the grief of losing children, the day-to-day physical care of your offspring was often delegated to a team of wet nurses, nannies, governesses, and tutors. This didn't necessarily mean a complete lack of maternal affection or involvement from you, but it could certainly create a different kind of emotional landscape and a more formal relationship between you and your child. Your role might be more focused on overseeing your children's overall upbringing, ensuring they received the appropriate education, especially for sons who needed to be trained for leadership, warfare, and estate management, and crucially, arranging advantageous marriages for them when they came of age. However, the pressure to produce heirs, the political implications of your children's lives, and the grief of losing a child to illness or accident were just as real for you as for your peasant counterpart, even if your tears were shed on silk pillows rather than straw. Ultimately, as a medieval mother, regardless of your social standing, you weren't raising children with the primary goal of ensuring their individual happiness or self-fulfillment in the modern sense. You were raising them to endure, to contribute to the family unit, to uphold their social and religious duties, and to carry on the family line in a world that was often indifferent, if not outright hostile, to their well-being. It was a monumental task that required immense physical strength from you, unwavering pragmatism, a deep well of patience, and a kind of fierce protective love that was tough enough to withstand the relentless challenges and heartbreaking losses of your time. When illness struck your medieval household, and it struck often, hard, and with terrifying unpredictability, the first responder, the family doctor, the local pharmacist, the on-call nurse, and often the spiritual counselor, all rolled into one exhausted, overworked, and probably quite anxious package, was almost invariably you. In an age before the discovery of germ theory, before the invention of antibiotics, before even a basic scientific understanding of how the human body worked or how diseases spread, your medical toolkit consisted primarily of herbal remedies passed down through generations, some helpful, some useless, some possibly harmful. Fervent prayers to a variety of saints, and a good deal of hopeful, often desperate guesswork. You were fighting invisible enemies with largely invisible weapons. Personal hygiene, or rather the distinct and pervasive lack thereof by modern standards, was a major contributing factor to the medieval health crisis for your family. Bathing was an infrequent and often complicated affair for most people. Water was laborious for you to heat and carry, especially in large enough quantities for a full bath, and soap, if available at all, was a crude, often harsh luxury made from animal fat and wood ash. To make matters worse, many medieval physicians actually believed that too much washing, especially with hot water, could open the pores of the skin and let in bad airs, miasma, or disease-causing vapors. So the prevailing medical wisdom sometimes actively discouraged cleanliness, promoting a sort of, quote, protective layer of filth theory. As a result, you and your children were often dirty, your clothes unwashed for long periods, and infestations of lice, fleas, and other parasites were simply a normal part of life. This, of course, created a perfect breeding ground for skin infections, intestinal parasites, and the rapid spread of all sorts of contagious diseases within your family and community. You might try your best to keep your children relatively clean, perhaps by wiping them down with a damp cloth, or ensuring their hands were washed before eating, if even that was common practice. But it was a constant uphill battle against the prevailing conditions, beliefs, and the sheer lack of resources. Your own hygiene would have suffered similarly, especially while juggling endless chores, childcare, and often being sick yourself. When a family member, a child, your husband, or even yourself fell ill, you would be the one to make a rudimentary diagnosis based on observable symptoms like fever, rash, cough, or pain, and perhaps by consulting local folklore or the village wise woman, and then attempt to provide treatment. Your pharmacy was not a well-stocked chemist shop. It was your garden, the hedgerow, the nearby woods, and the collective memory of your female ancestors. You would have possessed a working knowledge of various common herbs and their supposed medicinal properties. Chamomile for calming nerves or settling an upset stomach. Willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the chemical precursor to aspirin, for reducing fevers and easing pain. Comfrey or plantain leaves for making poultices to apply to wounds or sores, garlic for warding off all sorts of evils and maybe some infections, and countless others. Some of these traditional herbal remedies might have had genuine, albeit often mild, medicinal effects. Others were pure superstition, based on the doctrine of signatures, the idea that a plant's appearance indicated what it could cure. For example, a heart-shaped leaf for heart problems, or simply on long-held, unproven beliefs. A poultice made of cow dung for a burn, a necklace fashioned from dried toad parts to ward off the plague. Your medieval domestic medical cabinet was a wild and unpredictable mix of the possibly helpful, the utterly bizarre, and the downright dangerous. The understanding of how diseases were actually transmitted was virtually non-existent to you. As mentioned, illness was often attributed to air or miasma emanating from swamps or decaying matter. Another prevailing theory inherited from the ancient Greeks and Romans was that sickness resulted from an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health depended on these humors being in perfect equilibrium. Therefore, treatments often aimed at restoring this balance, perhaps by bloodletting, a terrifyingly common practice often performed by barbers, purging with laxatives, or inducing vomiting. Beyond these theories, illness could also be seen by you as a direct result of divine punishment for sins, a trial sent by God, or even the malevolent work of witches, demons, or evil spirits. So while you were trying to nurse your sick child, you might simultaneously be applying a herbal poultice, fervently praying for forgiveness for some unknown transgression, and anxiously looking around the hut for signs of bewitchment or demonic influence. The idea of isolating the sick to prevent the spread of contagion was not commonly practiced in a way that would be truly effective, especially within the cramped, overcrowded confines of your typical one-room peasant hut, where the whole family lived, ate, and slept in very close proximity. If one person got sick, it was highly likely everyone else in your family would too. Dental health, as you might imagine, in an era without toothbrushes, toothpaste, floss, or regular dental checkups, was appalling for your family. Tooth decay, gum disease, painful abscesses, and eventual tooth loss were rampant and accepted as an inevitable part of life. You might try to soothe your child's agonizing toothache with a herbal rinse, perhaps made with cloves, which have some analgesic properties, or by applying a poultice to the swollen jaw. But chronic dental pain was a common misery for people of all ages. Imagine trying to comfort your teething baby whose gums are raw and inflamed, or your young child with a throbbing dental abscess, with nothing but a folk remedy, a prayer, and a hug. If a tooth became too infected or painful, the only cure was extraction, usually performed by a barber, surgeon, or even a blacksmith, with crude iron tools and absolutely no anesthetic. Your loved one just had to endure the agony. The great specter looming over your family, the ultimate health catastrophe, was the plague. Devastating epidemics, most famously the Black Death, which wiped out a massive portion of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, but also numerous other, smaller outbreaks of various pestilences, were terrifying, swift, and seemingly unstoppable. When plague struck your village or town, you would have faced unimaginable horrors. Watching your children, your spouse, and your neighbors succumb in droves to a swift and agonizing illness, often characterized by high fever, delirium, and the telltale buboes, swollen lymph nodes. You would have had to care for your stricken loved ones, knowing the immense risk of contagion to yourself, and then deal with the overwhelming grief, fear, and societal breakdown that followed in the wake of such widespread death. There was no effective cure, no reliable prevention beyond fleeing the affected area, if that was even possible for a peasant family like yours tied to the land, or resorting to desperate prayers, penitential processions, and a host of superstitious practices. Even without the drama of major epidemics, the general background level of sickness and poor health in your household was incredibly high. Fevers of unknown origin, persistent coughs, like consumption or tuberculosis, debilitating digestive ailments, infected wounds that refused to heal and often led to gangrene or blood poisoning. These were everyday occurrences. As a medieval mother, you were in a constant state of vigilance, tending to the sick, worrying about the health of those who were currently well, and likely suffering from your own share of chronic ailments due to a lifetime of exhaustion, malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and exposure to unsanitary conditions. Your role as the primary caregiver within the family was relentless, demanding, and often heartbreakingly futile. You fought a constant, losing battle against invisible and misunderstood enemies, with a very limited and often ineffective arsenal of tools. The family doctor, as the dry humor might put it, was usually just the oldest woman in the village who had managed to survive thus far, and who remembered which local weeds weren't immediately poisonous. For you, health was not a given, not something to be taken for granted. It was a fragile, precious, and constantly threatened commodity, and its preservation, however imperfect, was one of your most demanding, most emotionally draining, and often most tragically unsuccessful tasks. As a medieval woman, when you got married, it wasn't usually the romantic climax of a love story, filled with candlelit dinners, heartfelt poetry, and choosing the perfect wedding dress. For you, it was, first and foremost, an economic and social contract, a practical arrangement, often decided by your families, with far more thought given to things like land, livestock, political alliances, and the need for household labor than to pesky, unreliable things like love, attraction, or your personal preference. Your marital status and the specific nature of your marriage profoundly shaped your entire existence, your rights, your duties, and your overall place in the world. It was less "I do" and more "I guess I have to" for survival. If you were a peasant girl, like most medieval girls, you were frequently married off at a very young age, sometimes in your early to mid-teens, occasionally even younger if a particularly advantageous match presented itself to your family. The age of consent, as we understand it, was much lower, and the societal pressure for you to marry and start producing children, future laborers for the family farm, or crucial heirs for a noble estate if you were of that class, was immense and unrelenting. As a daughter, you were often seen by your family as another mouth to feed and a potential drain on resources until you could be married off. Your marriage might bring with it a dowry, some goods, animals, or even a small sum of money if your family could afford it, which would go to your husband's family. Or, at the very least, it would relieve your parental household of the burden of your upkeep. What were your own opinions or desires on the matter of who you would spend the rest of your life with? Rarely solicited, and even more rarely considered. Romance, if it existed at all in your marriage, was a happy accident, a bonus, like finding an extra turnip in the pottage, not a prerequisite. Your dowry might consist of a goat, a few pots and pans, perhaps a slightly used cauldron, and the vague hope that your new husband wasn't a complete monster. Once you were married, your life was, by law and by custom, almost entirely subservient to your husband. He was the undisputed head of the household, and you were expected to obey him in all things. While the actual quality of marriages undoubtedly varied enormously, some were likely companionable, based on mutual respect, and perhaps even developed into deep affection over time. The fundamental power imbalance was stark and legally enshrined. Your husband had the legal right to correct or discipline you, which could, and often did, include physical violence, while the church and some secular laws put theoretical limits on the extent of this abuse. For example, he wasn't supposed to kill you or maim you permanently, which is a rather low bar. In practice, you had very little recourse or protection against a brutal or tyrannical husband. Your primary duty was to him, to the bearing and raising of his children, who were legally considered his, and to the efficient and frugal running of his household. The pressure on you to be a good wife, according to medieval standards, was enormous. This meant being, above all, fertile and producing children, especially sons. It also meant being industrious, never idle, always contributing to the household economy. You needed to be frugal, managing resources carefully, and avoiding waste. And, of course, you had to be obedient and submissive to your husband's will. If you were a peasant mother, this translated into a life of constant, hard labor. You were responsible for managing the household with extreme efficiency, making every scrap of food and every piece of material stretch as far as humanly possible. It meant assisting with the demanding farm work alongside your husband, producing essential goods like cloth and candles from raw materials, and, of course, the endless cycle of bearing and raising children. Your husband's social standing in the village, and indeed the entire family's basic survival, often depended directly on your competence, your hard work, and your ability to manage under incredibly difficult circumstances. If you were a noblewoman, your marriage was even more explicitly and transparently a tool of dynastic strategy and political maneuvering. Your marriage would have been meticulously arranged, often years in advance, to consolidate power between great families, to acquire new territories or wealth, or to forge crucial political or military alliances. As a noble girl, you might have been betrothed in your childhood or even infancy to a man you had never met, who might be from a different country, speak a different language, and sometimes be decades your senior. Your personal feelings, your compatibility with your future husband, your hopes and dreams, these were almost entirely irrelevant in the face of dynastic necessity. Your womb was, quite literally, a political asset, your most valuable contribution to your family's ambitions. Once married, you were expected to produce heirs, preferably many healthy sons, to secure the lineage. You also had to manage a large and complex household, which could be a castle, a manor, or even a royal court, overseeing staff, finances, and provisions. And you had to navigate the complex, often treacherous, and always gossip-ridden politics of the court. While you might have had servants to perform the heavy physical labor that your peasant counterpart endured, the mental, emotional, and political pressures on you as a noble mother were immense and unrelenting. Your social standing and your legal identity in the medieval world were almost entirely derived from and dependent on that of your husband or, if you were unmarried, your father. You had very few independent legal rights. You couldn't typically own land in your own name, though there were some complex exceptions, especially if you were a widow of high status or came from a powerful family. You couldn't enter into contracts independently, sue or be sued in court without your husband's representation or permission, or even make a will disposing of property without his consent in many cases. Your legal identity was, in many ways, subsumed into his. You were John's wife or William's daughter. Widowhood presented a particularly precarious and uncertain situation for you. As a widow, you might, under certain circumstances, inherit some property or gain control over your late husband's estate, especially if your children were still minors and you were acting as their guardian. This could, ironically, grant you a degree of autonomy and economic power you never possessed while married. However, you also became incredibly vulnerable. Without a husband's protection, you might be pressured to remarry quickly, often to a man chosen by your late husband's family or by the feudal lord who controlled the land, primarily to ensure that the property and its resources remained under male control and continued to provide service or revenue. If you were old, childless, or had no powerful male relatives to support you, you could easily face destitution, exploitation, or marginalization within the community. Some resourceful widows, particularly those who inherited wealth or a thriving business, did manage to carve out independent and even influential lives for themselves, but they were generally the exception rather than the rule. As a medieval mother, therefore, you navigated a world where your personal choices were severely limited and your obligations were vast and unceasing. Your marriage was less a partnership of equals based on love and companionship, and more a fundamental social and economic framework designed for survival, procreation, and the maintenance of the existing social order. Your worth, in the eyes of society and often in your own, was heavily measured by your fertility, your capacity for hard labor, your domestic skills, and your obedience to male authority. It was a life defined by constraints, by duties, and by a constant negotiation for security and well-being within a deeply patriarchal system. Yet it is crucial to remember that within these formidable constraints, countless women like you found ways to exert influence, to build meaningful relationships, to protect your children fiercely, and to endure with a strength, resilience, and quiet dignity that is often overlooked by history books that tend to focus on the deeds of kings, knights, and clergymen. One of your most relentless, all-consuming, and frankly anxiety-inducing responsibilities as a medieval mother was the daily, grinding task of feeding your family. In an era before the convenience of supermarkets, with aisles groaning under the weight of global produce, before the magic of refrigeration to keep food from spoiling, before reliable food supply chains that could bring food from afar, and before government assistance programs for the hungry, this was your daily battle against scarcity, spoilage, monotony, and the very real threat of starvation. Your ingenuity, your resourcefulness, and your sheer hard work in the kitchen, or, more accurately, over the single smoky hearth fire that served as your household stove, was often the critical difference between your family having enough to eat to survive and them succumbing to hunger and malnutrition. You were the commander-in-chief of a very small, very hungry army, armed with little more than a pot, a spoon, and an encyclopedic knowledge of how to make weeds taste slightly less like weeds. The absolute cornerstone of your peasant diet, the dish that appeared on your table, or, more likely, was eaten from a communal bowl on the floor, day in and day out, as we've mentioned before, was pottage. This wasn't just a simple soup. It was a culinary philosophy, a testament to the art of making something substantial and life-sustaining out of almost nothing. The pottage pot was often perpetually on the fire, or at least simmering gently for much of the day in your hut. It was a kind of never-ending, ever-evolving stew. The base was usually grains. Barley, oats, or rye were common, as wheat was a more expensive grain, generally reserved for the rich or for making finer bread. Into this grainy base, you put whatever seasonal vegetables were available from your family's small garden patch or foraged from the surrounding countryside. Onions, leeks, turnips. Oh, so many turnips. Cabbage, peas, beans, carrots, parsnips. And occasionally, if you were incredibly lucky, perhaps after a pig was slaughtered for a feast day, or if you managed to acquire some through trade, a bit of bacon, a scrap of salted meat, or some bones would be tossed in to add a hint of flavor and a little richness. You were an absolute master of stretching these meager ingredients. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was wasted. Vegetable peelings that weren't too tough. The outer leaves of cabbages, stale bread crusts, soaked until soft. Even the water used to boil meat, if you ever had meat to boil, would all find their way into your pottage pot. It was designed to be filling, to provide bulk and some warmth, even if it wasn't exactly a gourmet experience. Your medieval peasant cookbook, if such a thing had existed, probably would have had one primary recipe for pottage. Find some stuff, add water, boil it for a very long time. If it's still moving after an hour, boil it longer. Serve with resignation. Bread was the other essential staple of your diet, the staff of life. But again, this wasn't the fluffy, artisanal sourdough or the crusty baguette we might picture today. Your peasant bread was typically made from coarser, less refined grains like rye, barley, or a mix called maslin, wheat and rye. During particularly lean times, when grain was scarce, the flour might be bulked up with less palatable additions like bean flour, pea flour, ground acorns, or even, in desperate situations, things like sawdust or tree bark, just to make it go further. This bread was dark, dense, heavy, and frequently gritty from the particles of the millstones used to grind the grain. As a mother, you would usually bake this bread once or twice a week. If your village had a communal oven, which was often owned by the local lord, who would charge a fee for its use, either in cash or a portion of the baked bread, you might take your dough there. Otherwise, you would bake it on a hot, flat stone placed directly in the embers of the hearth fire, or in a heavy pot with a lid covered with hot coals. It was a laborious, time-consuming process. From grinding the grain by hand with a quern, if you didn't have access to a mill, to kneading the heavy, often uncooperative dough, to carefully tending the baking process. Meat was a significant luxury for most peasant families like yours, not a daily occurrence. It was typically consumed only a few times a year, perhaps on major feast days like Christmas or Easter, or if the family was fortunate enough to slaughter a pig. This event would provide meat for salting and preserving for the winter, as well as fresh meat for a short period. Chickens might be kept, providing you with a precious supply of eggs, and if you were very fortunate, an occasional bird for the pottage pot, especially if the chicken had stopped laying. Hunting game animals like deer, boar, or even rabbits in the Lord's forests was strictly forbidden for peasants. Poaching was a serious crime, often punishable by severe penalties, including mutilation like having a hand cut off, or even death. So the main sources of protein for your family often came from plant-based sources like peas, beans, and lentils, which were staples in the pottage. Dairy products could also supplement the diet if your family owned a cow or a few goats. Milk, however, spoiled very quickly without refrigeration, so it was often consumed fresh by children or immediately turned by you into more stable products like cheese. which could be hard and long-lasting, or butter, which could be stored for longer periods, especially if salted. The intensely seasonal nature of food production in an agricultural society meant that your diet varied dramatically throughout the year, creating a cycle of relative abundance followed by periods of acute scarcity. Summer and early autumn brought a welcome, though often short-lived, abundance of fresh vegetables and fruits from your garden, or foraged from the wild like berries, nuts, and wild greens. But late winter and early spring were notoriously difficult. These were the hungry months, or the starvation spring, when stored food from the previous harvest began to run dangerously low, and fresh produce was still weeks or months away from being ready. This was when your skill in preserving food throughout the year became absolutely critical to the family's survival. Salting meat, especially pork and fish, smoking them over the hearth fire, drying fruits, vegetables, and herbs, and pickling vegetables in brine or vinegar were your primary methods of food preservation. Vegetables like turnips and carrots might be stored by you in cool, dark-root cellars or buried in clamps in the ground. Fruits could be dried in the sun or by the fire, or, if sugar was available, which it rarely was for peasants, as it was an expensive, imported luxury, made into simple preserves. Failure by you to successfully preserve enough food to last through the lean months could, quite literally, mean starvation for your entire family. The risk of foodborne illness was an ever-present and often invisible threat for your household. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, especially in warmer weather. Contamination from dirt, insects, and rodents, which were common inhabitants of medieval homes, was a constant problem. You had to be vigilant, using your senses of smell and sight to judge the safety of food, but your understanding of what actually made food unsafe was, of course, limited by the knowledge of the time. If it smells okay-ish and doesn't have too many maggots, was probably a common, if unspoken, diagnostic tool for you. Food poisoning, with its accompanying vomiting and diarrhea, could be debilitating or even fatal, especially for the very young, the elderly, or those already weakened by malnutrition or other illnesses in your care. For infants, as we've stressed, breastfeeding by you was the absolute lifeline. You typically breastfed your children for extended periods, often for up to 2 or even 3 years, or until you became pregnant again. Breast milk was the safest, most nutritious, and most readily available food for a baby, providing not only sustenance but also crucial antibodies that helped protect against common infections. This, of course, placed a significant and continuous physical demand on you, especially if you yourself were undernourished, overworked, or frequently pregnant. If you couldn't breastfeed for any reason, due to your own illness, death, or an insufficient milk supply, the infant's chances of survival plummeted dramatically. Wet nurses were an option primarily for the wealthy. For peasant families like yours, finding a safe and reliable alternative source of nourishment for an infant was incredibly difficult. Animal milk from cows or goats was often contaminated and hard for a baby to digest, and attempts at hand-feeding with pap, a soft food you might make from bread soaked in water or milk, were often unhygienic and nutritionally inadequate. As a medieval mother, you were, in essence, a highly skilled quartermaster, a resourceful chef, a practical nutritionist, and a tireless food preserver, all operating under conditions of extreme scarcity and constant pressure. You performed daily miracles in your smoky, cramped kitchen, turning meager, often unappetizing ingredients into meals that sustained your family, fueled their arduous labor, and gave them a fighting chance in a world where hunger was a constant, unwelcome companion. Your culinary legacy wasn't one of gourmet dishes or fancy recipes. It was one of sheer, dogged, life-sustaining survival. We've talked a lot about the tough physical life of medieval moms, but what about how they felt inside? In a world with constant hard work, danger, and losing loved ones, the medieval mom carried a huge amount of emotional stress, and there wasn't much help or understanding for these feelings. Therapy back then meant telling your sins to a priest. He probably thought your sadness was a demon that needed to be scared away, or that you just needed to pray more. Stress and worry were part of her everyday life. Worrying if there would be enough food for the kids, if her sick child would live through the night, if her husband would come home safe from a war or a dangerous trip, if the crops would fail. These weren't just small worries. They were big, real problems every day. There was no government help, no safety net. Her family's survival depended a lot on her and her husband. Sadness was always around. As we've said, many babies and young kids died. It's likely that most medieval moms lost at least one child, maybe more. Losing a child is always incredibly painful, but in medieval times there wasn't much time or public acceptance for showing sadness for a long time. Life, and the need to take care of the kids who were still alive or have new ones, had to go on. This doesn't mean the sadness wasn't deep, but it was often kept inside or shown through religious ways. Losing a husband, brothers, sisters, or other relatives to sickness, accidents, or violence also added to this heavy load of sadness. Having no personal space or privacy in the usual one-room peasant house meant a mother was almost never alone. This could make families feel close and help each other, but it also meant there was no escape from the noise, the demands, and everyone's feelings. Imagine trying to find a quiet moment to think when you share a tiny, smoky hut with your whole family, and maybe some animals too. Religion was, for many, a big source of comfort and meaning. It helped them understand life, which was often very cruel. The church had ceremonies for birth, marriage, and death, a set of rules to live by, and the promise of a better life after death. People prayed to saints for protection and help. Prayer was a daily thing, a way to find peace, say thank you, or ask for God's help. For a medieval mom, her religion might have been what helped her get through unbelievable hardships. But religion could also cause worry, with all its talk about sin, going to hell, and God always watching. Superstitions and believing in magic also played a big part in daily life. People thought the world was full of unseen things. Angels, demons, fairies, ghosts. A mother might use lucky charms or special rituals to protect her kids from sickness, bad luck, or evil spirits. If someone got sick suddenly or a lot of bad things happened, it might be blamed on witchcraft or breaking a rule, which added more fear and uncertainty to her world. Even with all these problems, medieval moms showed amazing strength. They had to be strong, smart, and practical to handle their challenging lives. They found happiness in small things. A good harvest, a child laughing, a quiet moment by the fire, talking with other women in the village. They told stories, sang songs, and passed on traditions, keeping their culture alive. The mental strength it took to face such constant hardship is truly amazing. There were no self-help books or support groups like we have today, though women surely helped and comforted each other in informal ways. Her strength came from surviving every day, a quiet, often unseen heroism that helped families and communities keep going. She was the emotional rock of the family, the one who remembered traditions, and the silent carrier of its sadness. While your life as a peasant mother was a relentless, grinding struggle against poverty, hunger, and sheer physical hardship, if you were a noble mother, your experience, though lived amidst the trappings of wealth, status, and privilege, was brutal in its own unique and often equally unforgiving ways. Your cage might have been gilded with gold and hung with fine tapestries, but it was a cage nonetheless, with its own set of suffocating pressures, hidden dangers, and profound limitations. Instead of worrying about literal wolves at the door, or whether the turnip crop would fail, you worried about your husband's ambitious and possibly homicidal cousin, with a penchant for, quote, accidental poisonings at court, or the devastating political fallout of failing to produce the all-important male heir. Your anxieties were different, but no less acute. The paramount, overriding duty for you as a noblewoman, from the moment you were married, often as a very young teenager, sometimes even a child, in a politically or economically motivated, arranged marriage you had no say in, was to produce heirs. Specifically, healthy male heirs. These sons were needed to secure the family lineage, to inherit titles, lands, and wealth, and to consolidate or expand the family's power and influence. This was not a private, personal matter for you. It was a dynastic imperative, a public concern of the highest order. Your fertility, or perceived lack thereof, was a subject of intense scrutiny, gossip, and public concern. If you failed to produce a son after a few years of marriage, or if you produced only daughters, or worst of all, if you remained childless, you could face scorn, ridicule, the erosion of your status and influence, and the very real threat of your husband taking a mistress, or several openly, or even seeking an annulment of your marriage. An annulment was a complex and expensive process, but not impossible for the powerful, allowing him to try again with a new, hopefully more fertile, wife. Each pregnancy you endured was therefore a high-stakes gamble, not just for your own life and health, as childbirth was dangerous for all, but for the future of your entire house, your husband's legacy, and your own precarious position within it. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. Childbirth, as we've consistently noted, was a dangerous affair for all women, regardless of social class. For you as a noblewoman, however, it was often a more public, ritualized, and medically attended, though not necessarily medically superior, event. More attendants would likely be present at your birth. Experienced midwives, female relatives, ladies-in-waiting, and perhaps even university-trained male physicians, though their actual involvement in the hands-on delivery was often limited unless things were going catastrophically wrong, and their interventions, based on ancient Greek theories like the four humors, were frequently more harmful than helpful. However, this increased attention and access to supposed medical expertise didn't necessarily translate to better outcomes for you. In fact, some historians argue that the richer diet and less physically active lifestyle of many noblewomen could sometimes lead to more difficult or prolonged labors. And if complications arose, the intense pressure to save the heir, especially if it was a male, could lead to desperate, risky, and often brutal interventions by physicians who were more concerned with the dynasty than with your well-being. Queens, duchesses, and high-ranking noblewomen died in childbed with alarming frequency, their deaths sometimes sending ripples of instability, succession crises, and political turmoil through entire kingdoms or regions. Once your child was born, especially a precious heir, your direct, hands-on role in the day-to-day physical childcare was often quite limited, far more so than if you were a peasant. Wet nurses were commonly employed to breastfeed your infant. This practice was driven partly by social custom. It was often considered unseemly or beneath the dignity of a lady of your high status to breastfeed your own child, and partly by the practical desire for you to become pregnant again as quickly as possible to produce more heirs, as breastfeeding can sometimes suppress ovulation. Your royal or noble nursery would be staffed with a team of nannies, servants, and later, governesses and tutors, who handled the bathing, dressing, feeding after weaning, and general minding of the children. This delegation of care could, and often did, create a degree of emotional distance between you and your young children, though it's an oversimplification to assume that all noble mothers were cold or detached. Many, like you, were deeply involved in overseeing your children's upbringing, their health, and their education, even if you weren't the ones changing the medieval equivalent of diapers. which were probably just linen cloths. Your interactions might be more formal, scheduled, and focused on instruction rather than cuddling. The education of your noble children was a serious and carefully planned affair, particularly for sons who were being groomed from a very early age for leadership, warfare, estate management, and the complex duties of their social class. As their mother, you often played a significant role in selecting tutors, overseeing the curriculum, which might include Latin, rhetoric, history, music, and martial skills, and shaping your children's moral, religious, and chivalric instruction. Daughters, too, received an education, though it was typically focused on skills deemed appropriate for their future roles as wives of other noblemen and mothers within other noble households. This might include household management on a grand scale, needlework and embroidery often to a very high artistic standard, music, dancing, perhaps some literacy enough to read devotional texts or manage household accounts, and, crucially, the all-important art of courtly behavior, etiquette, and diplomacy. As a noble mother, you were often your daughter's first and most important teacher in these feminine arts. As a noble mother, you were also, by necessity, a key player in the intricate and often perilous game of court politics. You were expected to manage a large and complex household, which could be a castle, a manor, or part of a royal palace, overseeing a vast staff of servants, managing budgets, and ensuring provisions. You had to entertain important guests with grace and style, acting as a hostess for your husband and your family. And you had to cultivate alliances, navigate rivalries, and protect your family's interests in a world where power was constantly shifting and betrayal was common. Your behavior, your dress, your conversation, and your social graces were constantly under intense scrutiny. A misstep, a poorly chosen word, or a perceived slight could have serious consequences for your family's reputation and political standing. You are often a pawn in the larger power struggles of men, yet many astute and intelligent noblewomen like you learned to wield considerable influence from behind the scenes, through your personal networks, your strategic advice to your husbands or sons, your patronage of artists or clergy, and your subtle ability to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life. Arranged marriages were the absolute norm for the nobility, and as a noble mother, you would often be deeply involved in negotiating the marriages of your own children, seeking out the most advantageous matches that would benefit the family in terms of wealth, land, or political connections. This meant that your relationship with your children could be profoundly complicated by these dynastic considerations, sometimes pitting your natural maternal affection and concern for your child's happiness against the cold, hard necessities of political strategy. You might have to send a beloved daughter off to marry a much older, unknown man in a distant land, or force a son into a marriage he resisted, all for the good of the house. While you were spared the grinding physical labor and abject poverty of your peasant counterpart, as a noble mother you faced a different but equally potent kind of brutality. The constant, crushing pressure of dynastic expectation, the inherent vulnerability of your position in a deeply patriarchal power structure, the ever-present dangers of courtly intrigue and political instability, and the terrifying shadow of maternal mortality that respected no social rank. Your life was one of high stakes, where personal desires, romantic love, and individual happiness were almost always subordinate to the relentless demands of lineage, power, and social obligation. Your comforts and luxuries were many, but your personal freedoms were often heartbreakingly few. You lived in a gilded cage, beautiful on the outside, but often confining and perilous within. For you, as a medieval woman, whether peasant or princess, simply reaching what we would consider old age was a significant achievement in itself, a testament to a strong constitution, a good deal of luck, or perhaps just sheer stubbornness, with average life expectancy hovering somewhere in the 30s or early 40s. though it's crucial to remember this figure is heavily skewed downwards by the appallingly high rates of infant and child mortality. If you survive the perils of childhood and your intensely dangerous childbearing years, you might well live into your 50s, 60s, or even exceptionally beyond. Many mothers like you never saw your own children grow to full adulthood, let alone meet your grandchildren or experience the later stages of life. But if you did manage to navigate the gauntlet of disease, famine, accidents, war, and the particular dangers of female existence to reach your later years, what did life look like for you? Was it a peaceful retirement filled with respected elder status, or just another chapter of struggle? The physical toll of a lifetime of hard labor if you were a peasant, multiple physically draining pregnancies and childbirths for all women, and often inadequate or unbalanced nutrition would have been starkly and painfully evident by the time you reached your 40s or 50s. Aches and pains in the joints were a given. Arthritis, rheumatism, failing eyesight with no corrective lenses beyond crude magnifiers for the very wealthy and literate, significant tooth loss making eating difficult and painful, and a general state of chronic weariness were your common companions of advancing age. There were no retirement homes, no state pensions, no social security. Your physical well-being and basic survival in your declining years depended heavily, often entirely, on the support and goodwill of your adult children, particularly your sons, who might have inherited the family land or trade, and thus had the resources to care for you. If your children had predeceased you, or if they were too poor or too callous to provide support, your situation could be dire. In many traditional societies, including medieval Europe, older women like you, especially grandmothers, often held a respected and valuable position within the extended family and the local community. You were seen as the keeper of tradition, the living repository of practical knowledge about farming, healing, childcare, household management, and the storyteller who passed on family history, folklore, local legends, and moral tales to the younger generations. As a grandmother, you might play a crucial and very active role in childcare, helping to raise your grandchildren while your own daughters or daughters-in-law were occupied with agricultural labor, other pregnancies, or new babies. Your accumulated experience as a midwife, an herbalist, or a skilled artisan like a spinner or weaver could also make you a highly valuable asset to the household and the wider village. The archetypal image of the wise old crone, in the original positive sense of the word meaning a wise elder woman, full of folk wisdom and practical advice, has its roots in this reality. You were the memory of the community. However, respect and security in old age were by no means guaranteed, especially for you as a woman. If you, as an elderly mother, had no surviving children, or if your children were unable or unwilling to support you adequately, you could face a truly grim future. Poverty, neglect, social isolation, and homelessness were very real possibilities for the aged and infirm, particularly for women who had outlived their husbands or other male protectors, and had no independent means of support. Some, like you, might end up relying on the charity of the church, which did provide some alms for the, quote, deserving poor or the local community, but this was often meager, unreliable, and came with a degree of social stigma. The parish might provide a small dole of food or fuel, but it was rarely enough for comfortable survival. There was also a darker, more dangerous side to aging for women like you in the medieval period, one that could turn respect into fear and suspicion. As an old woman, particularly if you were widowed, lived alone, perhaps seemed eccentric or reclusive, or possessed a traditional knowledge of herbal remedies and healing practices, you could easily become an object of suspicion and fear in an era rife with superstition and a belief in witchcraft. In a world where misfortune, a failed crop, a sick animal, an unexplained illness, was often attributed to malevolent supernatural forces, an isolated and perhaps somewhat unconventional old woman like you could become an easy scapegoat. The witch hunts that intensified dramatically in the later medieval and early modern periods had their deep roots in these ingrained fears, prejudices, and misogynistic attitudes. An old woman living on the fringes of the village, perhaps a bit cantankerous or sharp-tongued, maybe with a pet cat and a reputation for knowing a bit too much about herbs, fit a dangerous and easily invoked stereotype. Accusations of witchcraft could lead to your ostracization, persecution, and a horrific death. If you were a noblewoman, old age, if you reached it, might bring a different set of circumstances. You might wield considerable influence as a respected matriarch, especially if you were a dowager, a widow who held property and titles from your late husband. You could play a powerful role in managing family estates, arranging advantageous marriages for your grandchildren, or offering sage political advice to your sons. You might retire to a convent, a common path for high-status widows, where you could live a life of piety and relative comfort, sometimes even wielding administrative power within the religious community. However, you too were vulnerable if you lost your male protectors, if your family fell out of political favor, or if your heirs were eager to seize control of your assets. Even as a powerful dowager, you could find your influence waning and your security threatened as you aged. The retirement plan for most medieval mothers like you, then, was simply to keep working and contributing to the household for as long as you were physically able, and then to hope, fervently, that the family you had dedicated your life to raising would, in turn, care for you with kindness and respect in your declining years. There was no concept of a leisurely, golden age of retirement filled with hobbies and travel. For most, old age was often a continuation of service and contribution, albeit perhaps at a slower and more painful pace, until the very end. If you did live to see your hair turn gray and your grandchildren play at your feet, your life was an extraordinary testament to incredible endurance, resilience,